Hi everyone, Mr. McIntyre here. So today we'll do 2.5. We'll talk about some absolute value equations. And let me start off by reminding you about what we learned about absolute value from Module 1. So absolute value is a math function that takes any number and turns it positive. So like the absolute value of 5 is 5. It was already positive. But the absolute value of negative 12 is positive 12. It takes that negative number and turns it positive. Now what we're going to do today, instead of just looking at numbers, we're going to look at equations that have absolute value in them, or expressions, things with a variable. And that makes it a little trickier. So let's start off today by talking about this equation right here. This says, now remember, those two vertical lines mean absolute value. So this in words says the absolute value of x plus 5 equals 8. So let's take that and break it apart and see if we can figure out what x might equal. The first thing I want you guys to realize is when you have an absolute value equation, you're focusing on the thing that is inside the absolute value. So in this case, it's the x plus 5. Now the x plus 5, I said in the notes there, it could equal either 8 or negative 8, since the absolute value of each one is 8. And what I mean by that is, if this x plus 5 ends up equaling 8, then what you get is the absolute value of 8. Well, the absolute value of 8 is 8. But if the x plus 5 equaled negative 8, then what this would say is the absolute value of negative 8, and absolute value turns it positive, so they both equal 8. So what we're saying is whatever is inside the absolute value, we don't know if it was positive or negative. We know that it's going to end up equaling 8 after we do absolute value, but it could have been 8 or it could have been negative 8. So what you have to do, whenever you're doing an absolute value equation, you're actually going to make and solve two equations. And the two equations for this one would be, number one, that x plus 5, the thing inside the absolute value, could have equaled 8. Or the x plus 5 could have equaled negative 8. We don't know which one, because the absolute value then turns it positive and the answer is 8. So we set up our two equations. Each one of these are a one-step equation. You could solve both of them by subtracting 5. In fact, I'll go ahead and do it. My first equation, if I subtract 5 from both sides, the 5's cancel. We've isolated x, and my answer is 8 minus 5 is 3. Now my second one, I'm going to solve the same way. I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. The 5's cancel, the x drops down, and my answer is negative 8 minus 5 more would be negative 13. So you get two answers. And you can test them. This is a good reminder for you guys. You can always check your answer by plugging it back into the original equation. If I take x equals 3, and I put it into the original equation, 3 plus 5 is 8, and the absolute value of 8 is 8. It worked. The 3 works. Put a little check mark by it to show you that I tested it. Now if I try the negative 13, and I put that in for x, you get negative 13 plus 5, which is negative 8. And then you get this one right here. The absolute value of negative 8 equals 8. So that one works too. So you're always going to get two answers for absolute value. You have to kind of break the equation up and set two equations up. One for this number that you see right here, and one for the negative version of that number. So let's do another real similar example. Let's say we're going to solve for m this time. We have 2m minus 7, absolute value, equals 5. So again, I don't know if that thing was positive or negative, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the thing inside the absolute value, which is 2m minus 7. I'm going to say that could have equaled two things. Number one, it could have just equaled that number right there, which is 5. Or the 2m minus 7 could have been the negative version of that number, And then the absolute value is why it turned into a positive 5. So it also could have been negative 5. Now, if you solve each of those two equations, you're going to end up with the two answers to this question. Absolute value equations have two answers. So let's start with the first one. I want to cancel out the minus 7 first, I think. So I'm going to do a plus 7 on both sides of the equation. Minus 7 and plus 7 cancel. 2m drops down, and 5 plus 7 is 12. So this was a two-step equation. I have one more. The last example we did one and we're done. This one, if I want to cancel out the 2 in front of the m, I need to divide by 2. So I divide both sides by 2. I isolated m. My answer is 12 divided by 2, which is 6. So the first answer is 6. To find the second answer, we're actually going to do the exact same steps. I'm going to add 7 and divide by 2 again. So let's do that. Second one, I'm going to add 7 to both sides. Minus 7 and plus 7 cancel. 2m drops down. And on the other side of the equal sign, we have negative 5 plus 7. That would be positive 2. Then we finish by dividing by 2. Divide both sides by 2. That 2 cancels with that 2. We isolated m, and my answer is 2 divided by 2, which is 1. So you guys got two answers for this question, 6 or 1. If you go back in and you plug them in, you can check them again. Like if I try 6 for m, I would have 2 times 6 is 12. 12 minus 7 is 5. Absolute value of 5 is 5. So the 6 definitely works. And if I try the 1, 2 times 1 is 2. 2 minus 7 is negative 5. And the absolute value of negative 5 gives you 5. So the 1 also works. So that's how absolute value equations work. You have to do two equations for every one absolute value equation. You have to set them up and then solve them. So, quick question for you guys to think about. Can an absolute value equation, or absolute value expression, equal a negative number right here? So what I did is I recopied the same example we did from the notes earlier, and I just changed that 8 to a negative 8. So earlier we did absolute value of x plus 5 equals 8. So now I'm saying, can that be a negative 8? And you guys can pause the video for a second and think about it. See if you can come up with that answer. But I'll go ahead and go over it with you now. The answer to the question is no, it can't. That can't ever be a negative number. And the reason is absolute value makes everything positive. So if this absolute value expression right here is always going to equal something positive, the other side of the equation can't be negative. You can't have a positive number equal to negative 8. It doesn't work. Those aren't the same. So if you ever see an equation like this, where you have an absolute value expression, it's equal to a negative number, don't try to set up two equations and solve. All you do is you write no solutions and you move on. There are no answers to this question. There's no x that I can substitute into this equation where the absolute value of some number is going to equal negative 8, because absolute value doesn't work that way. All right, there's one last thing I want to talk to you about for absolute value, and that's in a word problem or in an application. So absolute value shows up in word problems. It can represent distance or distance from a number. And it's good because it works in either direction. So if you have a word problem where you're saying like, okay, something, you have this kind of central point, and I might be a little bit bigger than that number, or I might be a little bit smaller than that number, that's a good absolute value question. So it's distance, either positive or negative, bigger or smaller, is basically what we're saying. So you could look for words like tolerance or allowance. Those show up in an absolute value word problem a lot. You might see a phrase like give or take. If you've ever heard the phrase give or take, it means like, yeah, it might be a little bit more than that or a little bit less than that. So let me show you an example. I think that's the best way for you guys to see this, is for me to actually do an example. So let's do this one right here. Here's a word problem. Let's say that the temperature in our classroom is always about 75 degrees, with an allowance of 4 degrees. Write an absolute value equation for the temperature in our room. So the allowance means our temperature is always about 75, but it could be up to 4 degrees more or 4 degrees less. That's what we mean by allowance. And I could have also said give or take. I could have said, okay, hey, our classroom is usually about 75 degrees, give or take 4 degrees. And that means maybe it goes all the way up to 79 sometimes, maybe it drops down to 71 sometimes, but it's usually around 75. So here's how we would write an absolute value equation. Let me start with this. Here is my absolute value, and this represents, before I even put any numbers or variables in it, this represents the difference in temperature from 75 degrees. Meaning it's usually around 70, 75, but it might be a little bit more than that, it might be a little bit less. So let's talk about our variable. You can do x. I'm actually going to use t for temperature. I'm going to say my variable in this problem is t. Now, to figure out how far away from 75 degrees we are in the classroom, I can take that temperature and I can subtract 75. Remember, the word difference actually means subtraction. So the difference in temperature means the actual temperature minus 75. Now, we know that that's going to be at most 4 degrees. But we don't know if we're 4 degrees hotter than that, 79, or 4 degrees lower than that, 71. So the T minus 75, if we're higher than 75, if we're at like 78 degrees, that's going to be a positive number, 78 minus 75. But if we're lower than 75 degrees, so let's say we're at 72 degrees, 72 minus 75 is going to be a negative number. But see, it doesn't matter, that's what we use the absolute value for. So we're going to say this thing equals 4. And that number over there, that's what we call the allowance, or the give and take. So the absolute value part, T minus 75, tells us how far away we are from the average temperature. 75 is like our normal classroom temperature. Put it in absolute value, so that means we can either be higher or lower, and then tell me what's the most it can change, the allowance. So there's the answer to our question. The absolute value equation for the temperature in our room based on this word problem would be absolute value of T minus 75 equals 4 degrees.